Hi Jay, welcome back from your holiday and
Hey,
your run. Glad to see you back. So, does any one of you have any topics or demos you would like to demonstrate?
Well, I could demonstrate this version history thing, but it's even hurting when I'm talking right now, so I can do that maybe next week.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, so Gurkan has a bit of a throat ache, sore throat, so it's hard to speak.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
okay. No demo for me, but maybe some discussion about the retention module. I post an issue on this, and I have just some question about how we manage and how we call the database with entity framework. Because I see we use a lot of the specification pattern that allows the developer to write a good code. But when we, for example, when we want to delete some elements, there is a different call to select data to get the ID, and then we pass into some method to get again some information, and at the end we just need to delete some workflow instance based on only on the ID. So we don't need to make many calls against the database and get a lot of data. And what I see is a minimum of CPU, and I've got many timeouts. I can understand that I don't have to use this kind of database with small DTU in production, but when I have only 10 or 20 workflow, I think I don't have to get some exception or timeout execution with this SQL. So I think maybe we can add some element to query to make better query against the database.
Okay, that sounds good.
I don't know if you have some times to look on the issue.
Sure, let's go over this topic in a second. Let's see, I do have a demo about background jobs in Elsa 3 and a Auth0 demonstration in Elsa 2. It's something I worked on today as a proof of concept for a client, so I figured it's interesting to demonstrate. And this is about protecting the Elsa API using whatever identity server you want. In this example, it will be Auth0. But then the question is, how can now the dashboard, which is a SPA, a single page application, make calls to the API, because the API is now protected, so the client or the dashboard needs to send bearer tokens. So I would like to show one approach to that. So that's a demo to look at. But yeah, let's start with the retention module. Sounds like there's some room for improvement there. Do you have you mentioned an issue that you opened?
Yeah, 3253. I'm going to open it.
3253. All right. Retention module job could cause timeout when deleting large data or when using a small DB. Yeah, pagination. So the idea here is that it takes one page at a time. For a database could have many workflow instances, so loading them all in memory at once would be insane. It would kill your application probably. So this is pagination. Using specification here, doing the filter pipeline, adding the selected instance IDs. Oh, so it returns workflow instances. And you're saying, could we maybe improve this by not returning the whole workflow instance, just identities or the primary key values?
Yes, because the data column is huge and could be huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And other thing is the delete many by IDs async. In this method, I don't post this method, but we get all the dependencies, so the bookmark, etc., to be sure that we delete everything. In this, we do a dbcontext.set, and I don't know when we do this if entity framework do a get to the database.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
If we look at, I will just open the solution and that. Okay, so if I take a look at, just open the solution. Okay, if you take a look at the entity framework workflow instance store, there is a delete many by IDs async, and in this one we have a do work callback with where we did the following: dbcontext.set for workflow execution log records, bookmark, and workflow instance. And when we did this line, I don't know if entity framework realized a SQL call to the database.
So this will invoke delete many by IDs async, and this supposedly should delete all the workflow execution log records for this set of workflow instance IDs, all the bookmarks, and all the workflow instances. And are you saying this is not happening?
This is happening, but in terms of performance issue,
Mm-hmm.
When I get my timeout, sometime in this method, and I was wondering if the dbcontext.set.askVariable.where, if this command realized internally by entity framework a call to the database to get the workflow execution log record where workflow instance ID is equal to, and then it loads the element in the local context, and then he is able to delete using the ID, or he deletes the entity. And if it does like this, there is also a perf issue because it loads all the entity. If I want to delete 100 workflow instance, I could download first many hundred of workflow execution log records.
Right. Yeah, that
be able
makes
to
sense.
delete it, etc., etc.
Yeah, even one workflow instance could have thousands, if not more, workflow execution log records, and this would try and select them all. Although the batch delete with workaround, it should happen server side, but even server side it could be a problem. So, and here it's even worse. Here it's gonna project them or get them from the server into local memory and then delete them one at a time. Just for Postgres, MySQL, and Oracle, but even if it happens server side with SQLite, maybe could be an issue. Maybe what the solution should be is to go back to the. So here's the cleaning up hosted service. It's doing it here. No.
So I know we can check if there is a SQL query on the client side with when we debug. I have some question about, can we do we have to continue to use specification pattern in this kind of method, or do we want to use maybe some specific SQL command?
Well, the reason for the specification pattern is to abstract away the underlying data storage. So we support MongoDB entity framework as an abstraction on relational databases. We support the YesSQL provider. So we have different providers, and the specification pattern allows us to abstract away the concrete implementation. So dropping directly into SQL here doesn't make sense in the current architecture. But what would make sense is to have a new specification. So we implement a custom specification called, let's say, delete workflow instances, and then the implementations of this particular specification can do the optimized querying. So if you implement the specification handler for EF Core, that could have optimized SQL. The same goes for MongoDB, the MongoDB handler for this particular specification, etc. So we can certainly do that.
That's what this is my first question, and the second question is, what about dependencies directly in the database using, for example, cascading delete?
What about that?
The cascading delete.
Yeah, what about that? You want to use it? You mean set up cascading delete on the database layer?
We just have to delete the workflow instance, and all the dependencies are deleted
by the database itself directly. Yeah, that's an option. Of course, you would have to be able to configure this dependency on the EF Core level, and also when using MongoDB, do we have a similar mechanism there? What about YesSQL, etc.? So we need to think about these things as well. But if there's a solution to that, for sure. Just as long as it doesn't require users to specifically execute some SQL script to make this happen for relational databases and another script for MongoDB. Ideally, everything is taken care of from code.
Okay, I have done some evolution on the first part in the job to be sure to not load everything in memory. So I will submit a PR on this to discuss. And if you could just show me an example about the handler to optimize firstly on SQL, and then we can optimize on the other provider.
Right, yeah, so let's take a look at EF Core first.
I don't know if you want to show something on your screen.
I wasn't sharing. Yeah. Let me start sharing. All right. So the place to look for in the example of the EF Core providers, every provider implements one of these interfaces. So here, this one implements iWorkflow definition store. We would be interested in the workflow instance store, this one. And this store will implement the following methods of the iStore of some entity, in that save async, add async, etc. And they all receive, or some of them receive a specification. So in this case, delete many. So one way to go about this here would be to update the delete async or the delete many or both, where you
Delete by many ID, for example.
So this one gets an I specification exactly. So here it uses find many specification, but what you could do is add a bit of code where you say if specification is my retention specification, for example.
Yeah.
Let's imagine that's a new specification. Then you do whatever you need to do, and the retention specification can carry any data you need to perform the right query, like the workflow instance, for example, or the set of workflow instances you want to delete. And then here you can do anything you like. You can inject all of the other stores. You can use the context directly. So the DB context, you can get this one directly and have access to all of the DB sets. And of course, execute SQL directly. So you can do all of the optimizations here. If it's not a my retention specification, then just execute the default logic. Now, I have to admit this architecture is a little bit rigid. It's not very flexible. I wish I didn't use the specification pattern in this way. I just had the abstract workflow instance store that wasn't this generic. Instead, if entity specific store would just have specific methods, then every implementation could have perfectly optimized queries to execute. One housekeeping note, guys, if you're not speaking, please mute your mics just to prevent background noise from getting into the call. So yeah, so you get the point, right? All right. So does that make sense, Jay, or was there anything else about this?
Yes, it's we can discuss over the time and then work on the Angular.
Yeah, sounds great.
I have one question, Sipka, about the version history in V3. You mentioned the execution workflows, execution log records. I just remembered that. Like when I was working on this, I noticed that we are not storing the execution log records based on the versions of the workflows, but only the workflow definition ID. So is that by design? Because when we delete a version, I cannot delete the log records because there is no versioning on that model.
So workflow execution log record should be linked to workflow instances, but you're saying that's not the case, or you're saying it's linked to workflow definition, but not the workflow definition version?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like there is a on the workflow execution log record entry, there is workflow definition ID, but not the version. So I was wondering if that by design or just a mistake.
Let's see. So here we have the workflow definition ID, instance ID. So maybe you can explain to me why we need a version ID for the workflow execution log record, because maybe it's a mistake, but I don't see why it would be necessary. But then again, I'm not implementing the versioning, of course.
Delete the version of the workflow. I thought like we should also delete the log records regarding that version.
I see. So yeah, that makes sense. But of course, you will also want to then delete the workflow instances. So if you delete the workflow definition, all of its instances need to be deleted. And this entity is dependent on each workflow instance ID. But I can imagine if you delete a specific workflow definition version, maybe the query could be optimized by being able to delete all workflow execution log records based on the workflow definition ID and its version, so that you don't have to first go over each workflow instance ID before you can delete this one. So yeah, probably makes sense for optimized deletion.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, good question.
Thanks.
All right, guys, anything else? All right, then I will continue with demos. I'll start with Auth0 for Elsa 2. Let me undo these changes first. So let me give you some context. As you host Elsa APIs online, you probably want to protect the API endpoints. Otherwise, anyone could invoke those APIs and create or delete workflow definitions or execute workflows, for example. And that's not good for obvious reasons. So just to give you an example, here are some of those endpoints. This one allows you to save a workflow definition or publish, or unpublished is supported as well. These API endpoints, they exist for client applications like the Elsa dashboard. But of course, as I mentioned, you don't want to expose this to the internet, so you should protect it somehow. And there's various ways that you can do. The most typical way to do it with ASP.NET Core applications, which your Elsa workflow server is typically, is to use ASP.NET Core authentication middleware. But then if you protect your API endpoints, you need a way for your client, in this case the Elsa dashboard, to authenticate itself itself, or at least provide whatever credentials are necessary to make the API calls to the backend. So what I did here is I set up proof of concept for a client, and I would like to demo what that looks like so as an example that you could use as well. I'm using Auth0, but it would work for any OAuth application. So it would also work with Azure AD or any identity provider. So first, let's take a look at the backend, or actually let's take a look at Auth0, the setup there. Actually, that's not a good idea. Let's start with the backend. It might be easier to explain. So I set up a sample here. So this is an ASP.NET Core application. It's ASP using .NET 6 framework. I'm just referencing this package, the JWT bearer, and the Elsa Server API project. It's a very simple application. All it does basically is host Elsa. So when this application runs, we have a workflow server running, but it has a couple of interesting things. First and foremost, I'm adding the application services, of course, like health checks. It's optional, but it's a good idea to have. Cross-origin resource sharing, I think, is what CORS stands for. This is important if your workflow server is hosted on a different origin compared to your dashboard. So adding this by default. During development, I'm hosting on different origins in any case, so it makes sense, but you need to be aware of the security ramifications if you allow any headers and any origin. So you may not want to do this in production. In production, you may want to explicitly specify what origins are supported. Here I'm adding Elsa API endpoints, and internally it does a couple of things like adding controllers, which is from ASP.NET, configuring Newtonsoft, configuring some routing. So this is very opinionated, and it's what Elsa requires in the current version. In the new version, it will also be opinionated because the client will expect JSON in a certain format, for example. Or maybe we'll make it configurable, where you need to make sure that both the server and the client are using the same JSON serialization settings. And it's adding API versioning here. But just to give you an idea what the Elsa API endpoints is doing. So that's that. This is adding ASP.NET Core authentication services. And here we're configuring it using JWT bearer defaults as the authentication scheme. And then here we are configuring JWT bearer by reading some configuration from Auth0. But this is not specific to Auth0. It's just, in this example, it's specific because I'm using this term Auth0. But if we look at the app settings, that's just a section name. You can name it anything you like. And these are all standard fields that you can configure on the options object you get here as an argument, the JWT bearer options. So basically on the server side, there's nothing OAuth specific because Auth0 because Auth0 implements the OAuth standard and OpenID Connect standard. This is very nice. Here I'm adding some more services. Currently this example doesn't use authorization, but you could if you wanted to. And finally adding the necessary Elsa services. So this is all dependency injection setup. Here we are going to build the application and then configuring the request pipeline. So we're using the CORS middleware, routing, authentication middleware, and authorization middleware, which again in this example is optional. And then here in the use endpoints, we are mapping the health checks at the root. So if we start the application, it will perform a health check and return the response or the result of the health check. And then here we are mapping controllers. And this is the key to protecting all controllers in your application, including the ones exposed by Elsa. So it will protect everything, which may not be ideal in all scenarios, although maybe you can, let's say your application has custom controllers that are supposed to be accessible by anonymous requests. I think allow anonymous will work, which is an attribute you can apply to your controller, but I'm not sure. But you can try it. But in any case, this will protect the Elsa API endpoints. So now the server is protected. It's hosting on 11,000, and if we start it, we see the health check response, which is an endpoint that we did not protect, which is good because it may be useful for health check services that need anonymous access to this endpoint. But the controllers, they are protected. So let's see if that's true. So let's say we want to list all of the workflows, and let's not provide any tokens. So no authentication, and then send. So here we get a response that the request is unauthorized, which makes sense because we protected the endpoints. So to make it work, we need to provide an access token. So let's take a quick look what that looks like. So it's protected using JWT bearer token authentication mechanism. So we need to provide a bearer token, which means we need to provide an access token. So here I set up a simple example using the wrong client ID. Let me fix that. So this takes us to the Auth0 dashboard. So in the dashboard, I set up a thing called an application, which is basically configuration of a client that's allowed to make calls to the Auth0 identity server. And it typically comes with a client ID and a client secret. In this case, to be able to request an access type, we need to provide a client ID and a secret and the audience. So we are going to use this client ID, this one here, and we'll take the client secret. The audience is correct and the grant type is client credentials. So if we submit this request, we get an access token, which I'm using this test script, which is very convenient of Postman. It's a way to execute a bit of JavaScript in response to the request. So we get this as a response body. We are parsing this into a JSON object and then getting the access token field, which we receive here, and storing it in an environment variable called access token, which we can then automatically use in other requests, such as here. Yeah, I'm gonna pass in that fresh access token. So now when I hit send, we get a successful response. Of course, there are no workflows in the system, but the response is valid. So now the question is, what do we do with the dashboard? So let's switch to the dashboard. Let's pretend this isn't here for a second and just start it as you would normally do. All right, so we see a blank screen. If we look at the console, we see something similar. We see a 401 response when requesting some endpoint. So this makes sense. Our backend is protected. So now let's see how we can allow the user to authenticate themselves so that they can actually use the portal or the dashboard. And for that, I wrote a small plugin called Auth0 plugin, which works like this. So here we are looking at a simple HTML file that hosts the designer. So that's this file you may be familiar with. It just uses the Elsa Studio root custom element and some Elsa Studio dashboard components pointing to the backend we are running. So that's this file, just for context. What this allows you to do is it allows you to install custom plugins, and that's what we're doing here at the bottom. So here we are listening for the initializing event of the Elsa Studio root element, this one. And then here there's a new function called register plugin factory, which lets you pass in a lambda or function that returns a plugin. And using this approach, you can return an instance of a plugin that's initialized with application specific settings. So here I'm gonna pass in a client ID, but this is not the same client ID as used for the server. So every application needs its own application representation in Auth0 with its own client ID and its own settings and its own authentication flow, basically. Here we were looking at the Elsa API application, and now we're going to look at the dashboard application. That's this one, and as you can see, it has its own client ID. So we're going to copy this one. Actually, this is the correct one. Then the domain is also already correct, and the audience as well. Domain, client ID, and of course these settings are important for your applications, like what are the allowed callback URLs. So since the dashboard is being hosted on localhost port this one, it needs to be the same. Same for this. All right, and as you can see, I just changed the settings here in this HTML file, and because of hot reloading, the page got refreshed, and now we do see the dashboard. Which also means if we look at the network tab, we see that it invoked a token endpoint. That's an endpoint hosted on my tenant on Auth0. So it requested a token, and the response included this is the payload. The response was the access token here. And after that initialization, we can now make authenticated API calls like getting features, or if we go to workflow definitions, as you can see, it's now able to make successful calls. And looking at the request headers, it makes sense because it's including the bearer token that we got from Auth0. And a bearer token looks something like this. So it includes an issuer, a subject, audiences, and some other claims. And this is extensible. Auth0 very extensible. You can configure many things, including scopes, and this can include application-specific scopes, which you can map to permissions that are required on your backend. So it's very flexible. So let's take a look at the plugin, the Auth0 plugin. So it comes with the Elsa core, but you could implement it yourself as well using Stencil or plain JavaScript. It's the same as any other designer plugin. When you use TypeScript, you implement Elsa plugin. You implement a constructor. In this case, this constructor accepts Auth0 client options which map to this object here. And I just store it in a private field. And then in this constructor, I start initializing some event bus events that I'm interested in, specifically the initialize event, which is fired by the root component. And this allows you to do things like in this case, creating an Auth0 API client, testing if the user is already authenticated, because then we don't need to do anything. But if we are not authenticated, we need to get an access token. And the way that works is by basically logging in to Auth0. So we redirect to the Auth0 login page where the user can enter their credentials. And once the user did that, Auth0 will redirect back to this page using the origin. And that means we'll get back to this. Somebody's making some noise. Huh.
It disconnect.
Okay. Yeah. So when we get redirected, we get through this code again, of course, because the page is reloaded. And this time we will have code query string parameter. And if that's the case, we let the Auth0 client API handle that code. So it will interpret it, probably store some cookie or whatnot. That's all handled by the Auth0 API client, which is very convenient. And here I'm just updating the URL basically, because otherwise you would see some ugly code equals and some value and something else. So it's basically going to remove that from history, which is also better for security, I assume. So that's one part. So that's getting the access token, or actually getting the user authenticated. And this handle redirect callback will store the access token somewhere, and it will make it available to the application, to Elsa dashboard, through the get token silently. It will internally cache the access token and presumably also refresh it. I'm not sure on the implementation details. I have yet to look into that, but it will give you the access token. And by the way, this is configure auth middleware, which is invoked from the HTTP client created event bus. And this is invoked by Elsa as soon as it's about to instantiate an Axios client, which is like an HTTP client. This event gets fired, giving all plugins the opportunity to set up the HTTP client. For example, Axios supports middleware, which is very convenient for us because that means we can attach custom headers to each outgoing request. So in this case, we want to always attach the access token. So that's what we're doing here. And that's basically it.
That's great. And in your demonstration, we do not see the login page because you are using the same user as the Auth0 dashboard?
Yeah, that's a good question. So actually that's because I was already signed into my tenant on Auth0, but let me show you by clearing the data, close all windows. And now that all my cache is emptied, I don't have any cookies anywhere anymore, we will now see the login page. So we'll go to localhost this. And now we do see the login page because you see the domain here. So this is my tenant on Auth0. And I need to log in with a user that's known to Auth0. So in this tenant, I created one demo user using my personal email address. So this one. So this is my email, my password. And now I will sign in and I'm signed in. Yeah. All right.
That's great. I think we could then add a more custom plugin on the dashboard or OpenID in general.
Exactly. A more generic component would make a lot of sense. So we could have an OpenID Connect module where everything is configurable through the constructor. Like here I did it very specifically for Auth0, but you're right. We could add an OpenID Connect generic module, making it very flexible and accessible to many users because this is a much requested feature.
On my side, I already use Auth0, but I use also an identity server as an identity broker between my solution and Auth0. So I need an OpenID plugin. So I think I will take a look at this implementation of Auth0 and derive an OpenID plugin for this.
That makes sense, yeah. And that would be great to have if you want to contribute another module called OpenID. That's wonderful. Let me know if you need any help with that.
Yeah, and I think after the next step could be to add some role and policy on the different API, or to be able to make some policies, for example, administrator, viewer, to see the workflow instances, for example, and be able to get the role in the token and only authorize some people to access some part of the dashboard.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be terrific. Would probably require some changes to the API. For example, if we look at the Elsa Server API project where we have the endpoints and we look at, let's say, workflow definitions, delete. So right now it's public, but we protected this one in program here using this. So this is protecting everything, but doesn't take into account policies or roles and that kind of thing. Although you can provide policy names, but this would be provided to all controllers. But if you want more granular control over what certain users can do using their permissions, we need something like authorize. And then here we should either provide a policy name and or a set of roles, but this would be very opinionated, right? It would still be helpful. We can just define a set of policies, and then it's up to the application implementer to configure the requirements for each policy here. So it's still very flexible.
Yes. The idea to see if we can, or if we have to create some generic role in a discussion to add some attribute on the controller and allow for example, to map if we decide, for example, to create some basic role and add authorized attributes, we have to let the developer and the implementer to map his own role on our generic role.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that.
Yeah, I think one of the options currently that we can do right now is that we can write just custom authorization handler, like one big class to handle all kinds of requests. And then you can just put the conditions. If this is the endpoint, allow or deny. So it could be helpful if we can just break it down, for example, to operations, whether it's a create, edit, delete, or update. Then in that case, we can just write our own custom handler without even forcing any policy in the specific controllers, just by defining some operations that we are trying to achieve. And then we can just write our own handlers and define whatever logic that we want.
Yeah, exactly. That's another approach you could take. Yeah, great. Okay, nice. Unless there's any additional comments or questions, then I will show the background jobs.
Yeah, maybe because I missed the initial, I wanted to see the current credential manager because I tried to run the demo myself, but since I'm currently away, I couldn't run it.
The credential manager, the new feature you mean that was recently merged?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't demo this one, and I have yet to try it myself. I've seen some demos from the developer, but I'm gonna ask them to see if they may be interested in demonstrating it on the weekly call.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool. Otherwise, I will go through it myself, and I can do a demo as well instead. But we will see.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so the background jobs in Elsa 3, I mentioned this the last meeting, I think, or the meeting before that. And it's basically a way to, as a developer, to implement some work that you want to execute in the background. So not in response necessarily to an HTTP request or not based on a timer. You may want to be able to schedule it manually or in response to a timer or in response to a request, but it should be non-blocking. That's basically the idea. There are solutions out there like Hangfire, like Quartz.net, and that's great. Typically, the way you would work with that is you would have some code that then schedules a job, and the job gets handled by Hangfire or by Quartz.net. With Elsa 3, we have that as well, using Hangfire or using Quartz.net. But with this feature that I'm about to show, these jobs now become available as activities. So you can orchestrate what jobs you want to execute and then block the workflow until the job is finished. And then you can continue the workflow. So it's a nice way of, or an easy way of orchestrating work. So yeah, that's what I want to show. So first, let's take a look at an example. Here I have an example job called index blockchain, and it's going to do something very simple. It's going to write something to the console out, wait for 5 seconds, and then write something else, just to show that this is a long-running process in the background and how you can use it from a workflow. Okay, so let's see, read this one. So here we look at the designer. Here are the activities, and here we see this job that I created. So it's under the jobs category. I will add it here, add to activities for demo purposes. This will say start. This will index the blockchain, and this will tell us when it's done. And the reason I'm showing these start and end activities is to demonstrate that this workflow will be suspended while this is executing. And for that, to properly demo that, I should probably increase the time from 5 seconds to, let's say, 15 seconds. And then we will publish this, copy the definition ID so we can run it from the API. All right, so before I run, let's take a look at the console here. Let's clean this up and send. So here we see start and the first line of the job, which is now running. Oh, I was a little bit too late. It finished already. Let's start again. Of course, here we see that it finished and it ended, but I want to show that it was really suspended. So refresh this, and here we see this workflow is it's in the state. It has the status of running. Substatus is executing. Yeah, so it is suspended. It's out of memory. It's a little bit hard to prove it without actually going through a debugger, but I'll leave that as an exercise to you. But yeah, it's finished the work. And the cool thing about this is that you don't have to create a custom activity. You just implement the job by implementing or inheriting from the job base class. And the way this works is that there's an activity type provider that looks for all job implementations and then basically wrap each job into an activity that you can then choose from the picker here. And the first time I mentioned this, I think was you, Mohammed, who asked the question, what's the difference between a job activity and a regular activity?
Yes, correct.
Exactly. And really the only difference is that this job executes in the background while an activity runs synchronously, right? So when this executes, workflow execution doesn't continue until this is done. And this happens synchronously in memory. The workflow remains active, etc. But it did make me think some more that why not take it a step further and allowing activities themselves to declare or to be configured to run asynchronously. So in parallel, it would, for example, allow you to branch out to multiple branches of execution, have multiple activities execute without each branch having to wait for the other one to finish. So that's something I'm researching as we speak. And this way we could have, let's say you have a custom activity that makes an API call to some Azure function, but it's potentially very slow, could take minutes maybe. You don't want the entire workflow to be in memory while that is happening. So those kind of activities you want to execute asynchronously in the background, like a job. I'm not sure it's going to be implemented like a job, but I am wondering what would be a good way to configure an activity to execute in the background. Would it be a setting here, settings that you can configure for even for the write line activity, for example, to execute in the background, or should it be kind of activity? So if you look at a given activity like this one, I think it has a property called activity kind, but maybe it's not implemented in 3. I don't think I have it here, but in Elsa 2 there's this concept of activity kinds or something like that. Here is an enumeration. So an activity could be an action, could be a trigger like HTTP endpoint, or maybe it could be a job. This is currently not used. It's not implemented. So that's a question. If you have any thoughts on that, please do let me know.
So basically, like an action activity, if it is running for a long time, when I look at the workflow status, I will see that it is running. Yeah? It will keep running until the activity finish. But what I understand, in case of a job, the workflow will become suspended and it will wait for the background job to finish. Then it will resume execution of the workflow.
That's right. Although you make a good point there, because even though the workflow will be put out of memory and persisted, the status in Elsa 3 will remain running, but it will not be actively running. It's just a status that the workflow isn't finished yet. Even it may be waiting for user input, and while it's waiting for that, the workflow doesn't exist in memory. Only once that input is provided will it be loaded from memory. But the logical status will be running and the substatus will be executing. Let's see what.
Because in Elsa 2, if I see that workflow is running for a long time, I start to get worried.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in Elsa 2, it should be suspended. If you expect it to wait for something, it should not be actively running. In Elsa 3, it will be running, and there's a bunch of substatuses suspended. So it could be the main status could be running, but then the substatus should be suspended if it's waiting for a job to finish, for example.
We can pass some data to the job.
Not right now, but that will be added as well. That's very important. And not just pass in data, you should also be able to provide a result or some output.
But can I terminate a job?
Not currently, but that's a good question. You should be able to terminate it somehow. At the very least, there should be an API to do so. And then, of course, maybe from the workflow, maybe you want to split execution and then start a job on the one hand and have a timeout on the other hand. And if that one fires, maybe you want to kill the job, for example. Or maybe jobs should have a max timeout or a timeout value that you can configure. But that's a good question. Let me write it down. So yeah, that's demo about job activities. And as I said, I'm investigating ways to implement activities that can run in the background, which would solve a lot of issues actually that I know of.
Yeah, but if some activities have the assumption that they stay in the memory for the course of the execution, maybe it will cause issues. I'm not sure.
Yeah, if we make this configurable, so maybe some activities will execute in the background and others won't, and then we know upfront which ones we could mark them with the activity kind maybe. I'm leaning towards that as well.
Yes.
Yeah, and once we have that, then maybe there's no need for a job itself to be exposed as an activity. At the same time, it could be an interesting option because in some scenarios you just want to execute a job outside the context of a workflow, as is the case with, when you implement Hangfire jobs or Quartz.net. Yeah,
Oh, definitely the concept of the job is very interesting. Yeah, if you can manage it from the workflow, it will be very helpful. So I can just run something and then wait for it to finish and come back to it without worrying that my workflow is going out of control. That is really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I actually need to go. If there's any questions, let me know.
Yeah,
It's
just
okay.
2.9. Elsa 2.9 is...
Elsa 2.9, there's still issues outstanding. Let's take a quick look. Yeah, we still need to fix these issues. I haven't had time to look into them, but yeah, I don't think we should release without these ones done.
Yeah, that's fine. So probably in September then, because August is a bit difficult.
Yeah, I think so. We are already 23rd. Yeah. Let's aim for September.
Sure.
And in fact, let me update the milestone. I don't want to put too much pressure, so I'm gonna put in the last day of September. And of course, if you have any availability, please take a look if you can.
We'll try to help.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks for attending today, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Bye.